pandemics, because the experience that we had of having no data at all and essentially having to create data series in order to understand what was going on was probably unlike any previous experience of measurement, and I felt very strongly about getting that right all the way through. We had big debates on how to measure deaths, for instance, which is the most famous of the debates, but there are endless debates below that. And there are some things that were really important that weren't happening and needed to happen right from the start. Like, for instance, the ONS series of measurement of data at first. When the first iteration of that was put in place, they didn't use it wasn't the ONS, but they didn't use a nationally balanced sample, and so the data would jump. And so getting the right structures of measurement in place right from the start is incredibly important to me. I have enough understanding of it to know what the problems were, but also Secretary of State had endless other things to do. Then the other part of it is that makes me really keen that this piece of work happens and is done right, is not just for learning lessons so that we can manage future pandemics better, it's actually for the day-to-day management, especially of the health service. Because in health, because of privacy concerns, people in the past have been fright of using data in a modern way, and we really challenged that successfully and got in proper data experts to help to manage data just for the day-to-day running of the NHS as well. So there's the side of there's the measurement side and there's the use of data properly inside the NHS. I ended up I worked out after a couple of months of the pandemic that one of the problems was that my questions that I was asking with a reasonable ability to communicate in this world were then being passed through private office who were generalists and being asked of the statos, right, having gone through a filter of a generalist. So I got a data expert into my private office to handle data issues so that when I had a question, the question that was then put into the machine was more intelligent than the way I'd asked it, rather than being turned into a generalist thing. And this guy, he was called Adam Langren. I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning his name. He was amazing. And in the end, I had my favourite WhatsApp thread through the whole pandemic was called Daily Data. And Adam worked out ways of data presentation of how the pandemic was going, case numbers, death numbers, age breakdowns, and how to present that. And he was like, what became known internally as the Langren charts were a bit like the Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. It was how do you take as much data as possible and put it into one chart through a combination of using lines and bars and colours, basically. And he was absolutely brilliant at it. So I had some really high-end support, especially by the end, but we had to build from almost nothing. And so the more of that learning that we can retain for the future, the better. So that's why I'm here.
I mean, why don't we sort of plunge in there at the beginning? I mean, thinking back to the kind of early days of February, March, obviously you got COVID yourself at that point. You were in the thick of things, you were trying to make urgent decisions in what sounds like a kind of almost data-free or low data environment.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about how that worked, at least
Well, the early days were January, and the first bit of data we got actually came quite early, and that was the genome of the virus. And when that was published, that was incredibly important very early on, because it allowed us to devise a test, and it allowed the vaccine teams to get going on the vaccine. And that happened in the first couple of weeks of January. But in terms of measuring it, we literally started with one case, as happens. And at first it was, so that was just, at first this was just written in emails from one person to another. And then in about the middle of February we got the first data dashboard, which was just plain Excel spreadsheet.
And who was that coming from?
It was coming from Public Health England. But here, for aficionados, the next problem was that they got a case in Scotland. And getting UK numbers was always one of the hardest practical parts of the daily announcements. So do you remember the chart that came out every day at 4 o'clock? It was a total nightmare getting that sorted, because getting the UK numbers when the measurements were taken and collated by 4 separate agencies was always the time limiting factor on that. And then, but after about a month, it was clear that that essentially spreadsheet-based approach wasn't going to work, so we had to get proper feeds through. But at the same time, of course, the absolutely central policymaker's point is the gap between the measurement and the true underlying, the true unmeasurable underlying, right? At this point, we didn't have enough tests, because we started with no tests, and then tests were built in a linear fashion, but the progress of the virus until lockdown was brought in, that was essentially exponential. And so, and so if you look at the graph of positive cases, right, the second wave is huge compared to the first wave. It was bigger as measured by hospital admissions, but it's not 10x, and that was all because of the expansion in the amount of testing. So you have to remember the difference between the true underlying and the measured number, and that your measured number is only a proxy for the true underlying.
You talk about Adam, your kind of data whiz who you brought in, but it seems like underlying that is a story of perhaps there not being a lot of great data skills in government private offices. Tell me a little bit about that, how that worked, how that changed over time.
Well, so in the health service, you specifically have NHS Digital, whose job is to understand and grip this and publish the data. The challenge was that NHS Digital was a separate, nominally independent arm's length body, and there's no modern organisation that has their digital core and their data production core separate, under separate leadership than the main business. I mean, it's a totally 20th century view of how you run something. It was done that way because of concerns over privacy, but the concerns over privacy trumped the ability to use data in order to drive better decision making, both operationally and in terms of measurement and therefore policy making. So that was hard. Getting in an expert to be my sort of primary interlocutor was incredibly important. At the same time, we had to serve up data for 2 other audiences. One was the number 10 and cross-government audience, who weren't as au fait with the health world initially, although obviously got completely steeped in it by the end of the pandemic. And the second was the public, and maybe we'll come on to the public in a bit, because there was toing and froing over what data was shown to the public. Are you okay? Was you okay?
Yeah, just went down the wrong hole. So
the ability to get data across Whitehall was really hard at first as well, and Whitehall was and still is to a lesser degree siloised in data in a completely over-the-top, unnecessary way. Right? Government is one legal entity, and it should, in my view, be one data entity. So, for instance, when we were getting the shielding programme up and running, the data was critical to that for 3 reasons. The first is we needed data analytics to understand who was most at risk from COVID. So that's a sort of clinical question that required data analytics. What prior conditions that might be measured make you more susceptible and therefore should make you have to shield? Combination of age, certain conditions. The second is how do you then essentially verify that you've got right the list of people who need the extra help, for which we put in a human element, which was checked with the GP, but essentially we had to then back out the list of who should be shielded from the national, I say England-wide data medical records, not all of which are digitised. but at least before we got to the pandemic, the summary care record was digitised on a universal basis across England. If we hadn't had that, we would have been in all sorts of trouble. And then the third was making sure that that data on identity of people who needed help got through to the local councils and the DWP who were doing a lot of the help. Now, previously the view was health data shouldn't go to DWP because DWP will then make a judgment based on your health data whether you can work or not, so there's a lot of caution around that. But this was about saving people's lives, because literally we were telling people and writing to people to stay at home, and we needed then DWP and the local council to go and knock on the door of these people to check they're okay. So that's just one example of the in each of those three cases, the data was in a silo. The silo walls needed breaking, and for measurement, and for policy making, and for operational reasons, they needed breaking down. And it took, top level ministerial meetings. I remember, Therese Coffey was brilliant on this. She's a science PhD by background. She was, she was running DWP. I was at Health. We got in Chris Townsend, who previously run the broadband rollout, to really knock heads together. But that's just one example of where it was absolutely critical to get this right.
That's really interesting. And it sounds like you've also got this thing which you've certainly heard in other places about a few civil servants who, maybe they're statisticians, maybe they're in the government statistical service or in some technical part, who are good at statistics, who are quantitative.
Yeah.
And then the vast majority of people who are, I don't want to say classics graduates, that's a cliche, but who are not quantitative. And that feels like that must have been quite a big cultural.
Yeah, it was hard. Yeah, and the ability to translate from one to the other is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
But the top clinicians are well trained in that, right? Because they take highly scientific, numeracy based concepts and they talk to patients all the time. So actually, it is part of the top clinical data set. JVT and Chris Whitty in particular were amazing at this, and all the top clinicians were. It's a bit unfair to draw them out, but they were amazing at it. But we then, it is worth touching on. I don't know whether you're going to come to this. We did end up in a tangle a couple of times with the stats agencies, and to a degree that was a lot of that was quite unfair, because they approached it as if we had a classic 40-year-long data series, and were and the accusation, which was false, was that we were playing fast and loose with it. The truth was we were short of data, and the measurability of some of that data was really, really tough, as in the accuracy of the data. I don't mean that in a benevolent sense, just the ability to match the data we were publishing to the truth of what was going on the ground. When we published that there were 3 cases in early February, there were probably hundreds of cases, but nobody knew. And so unmeasurability is a serious problem. And it was, and of course so that's a problem. And then on the other side, the communication out with government, the communication of risk in a world of uncertainty is one of the hardest things to do in the public sphere, right? Because tabloids understandably are looking for their story, and that's what they do, and that's their job. And so the ability to communicate is in a highly contested media environment is a real art form. And so sometimes you have to choose what to present in a certain way. I mean, it really came to a head over the forecasts. The forecasts were put out with the best of intentions. Then, if they didn't happen, the people who made the forecasts were attacked in the press. That is not fair. And often the forecast didn't. There was this sort of theme going around. Well, you forecast that 500,000 people would die in the first peak, and they didn't. But no, we brought in a lockdown. That was a forecast of what would have happened if no action had been taken. So there's the ability to discuss subtleties of statistical analysis and these difficulties and challenges of measurement in the public sphere is really hard. And and we were making judgments about how best to do that all of the time. And I think it is not reasonable to hold the public communicators, whether it's the politicians or the officials and experts, to account purely on statistical standards. You've got to take into account the consequences of the communication, because what matters is what people hear, not what you say.
That makes sense. You talked earlier about death measurements and that being a particular area of where the statistics were inaccurate. And I'm conscious we have Sheila Byrne as one of our speakers today, who's said more than most on the inadequacies of these stats. But tell me a bit more about how the challenges of measuring deaths affected your decision-making process.
Well, so at first, the measurement of COVID deaths was the measurement of people who died who had at some point a positive test for COVID. And in the first few weeks, that was a reasonably valid proxy. But as time went on, and especially as over the summer of 2020 the death rate came right down, it became less and less valid, because the time from the time at which you might have tested positive to the time at which you died expanded. And so we had to switch to have a time limit on that. Now, I would have loved to have had a statistical measure which was how many people have died from COVID. But the problem is, as has been demonstrated afterwards, and I'll come back to that analysis afterwards, that is essentially impossible directly to measure, because lots of older people especially, but not only, die where COVID is a contributing factor, and you can't really work out what percentage that is. Some die of something else when they have COVID. Some have had COVID, had a bout of COVID, and then recover, and then die of something completely independently. And all of these deaths are sensitive. These are loved ones of a family who care deeply about the fact that person has died and why they might have died. And so I was very strongly advised not to try to seek a measure of people who died from COVID, because essentially that leads just to putting a burden on clinicians, which would lead to an inaccurate measure. And instead to try to have a measure that was consistent over time. And where we settled was that we measured both those who had died having tested positive up to 60 days before and up to 28 days before, and then we used as the model, the headline figure, the 28-day figure, not least because that's where Scotland already had got to and wanted to stick with for understandable reasons, and we wanted cross-UK comparability. So that whole furore, which took place over several weeks of the summer of 2020, led to that measure. I think it was about as accurate a measure as you can get. Of course, there are people who caught COVID earlier and then died later, who would not directly count in that measure. Of course, there were people who would have, even in a 28-day period, caught COVID, recovered, and then died of something completely separate. So there's false positives, false negatives, but what we were looking for was as consistent a measure as possible in order to be able to measure over time. It's absolutely straightforward to make criticisms of the measure, but the point is that no measure was perfect, and we needed the least worst measure of this. Now, then come back to post-pandemic, at least in the UK, analysis, and what Chris Whitty told me all the way through, and people like David Spiegelhalter were saying at the time, is you're only actually going to know when you compare the baseline number of people who die in a period with those above with the figures in the COVID years, and that's what now has been done. And the UK measures have been shown to be about as accurate as anybody in the world, and others, including others who were lauded at the time, have been shown to have had quite lowball numbers. And in a way, I put up with I had the accusation over and over and over again that we had the most deaths per head of population in Europe due to COVID. We knew at the time that was likely to be revised to be not accurate, but we couldn't say so, and it was frustrating but it didn't matter, because what mattered for policy making was having as linear consistent as possible a measure, so you could see the trends, because actually what mattered for policy making was R, and the shape of the curve. Are we in essentially exponential growth or are we not? And so for policymakers, where we ended up, I think was the best measure, but imperfect. But for political presentation, it was not the best measure at all. But I decided we should go on the best measure for the substance rather than for the politics.
So with quite a few of the things that you've talked about there being things being in a pretty difficult state at first, and then a huge amount of effort to get statistics and data into sort of somewhat acceptable shape so that you can review your jobs.
Yeah.
If this happens again, is there, when I say this, it could be a pandemic or it could be some other data sensitive.
I think it's, if isn't what I would query, it's when.
Eventually. The question, I guess, is this something, could we be better prepared, or is it that we just need to be quickly off the blocks in terms of getting a new data infrastructure up and running? What could we do to...
Well, the single best way we can be better prepared is having more data skills in Whitehall. 100%. Incredibly important. And we need both pure data skills and we need data translation skills. The two are both very, very important. It is not just getting the underpinning technology, which is necessary, and the people who can, use that technology. It's then people who can interrogate the data and people who can describe the data both verbally and every which way, and who can and then take. So that policymakers, including stats experts, can take decisions based on that data. Now, I think we are far ahead where we were. I've spent a decade being frustrated about this in Whitehall, and I took a whole statistics bill all about giving the ONS more powers to try to improve the use of data in Whitehall. But it's human capability that really matters. I don't think the shortage is in, frankly, human capability in the broader society, right? Here we are at the Royal Statistical Society. We have some of the best stats and data analytics in the world here in the UK. It's about, and we have some amazing people doing it in Whitehall. The hard bit is one quantity, but also the connection between the statistical ability and the ability to present that and then soak that up. I mean, the NHS is a case in point. The NHS is incredibly rich in data, but still, at early parts of the pandemic, we couldn't get the answer to the question, how many beds have you got? And it's partly because it's not actually an easy question to answer at the technical level. At what time of day, right, is a good retort to how many beds have you got? And do you mean that's beds that are fully staffed or not? Do you mean that's beds that we could expand to if we squeeze staff ratios? There's a whole different, there isn't an easy, Daily Mail answer to the question how many beds you got. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister needed to know as a ballpark figure how many beds. Is it 80,000? Is it 120,000? It does matter, or even giving a series of, this is a baseline figure, this is a stretch figure. You need different ways of describing the bed capacity of the NHS. If you send somebody home with a measurement device, like a blood ultrasound measure, are they taking up a bed? No, they're not, but they're still in bed and they're still being measured, and you still need then the human capability to care for them. So the NHS has been much criticised because it didn't have an answer to that question. I understand why they didn't, but I'm using it as an example of the need for statisticians who can grapple with the question and provide the information that a lay, non-stats expert policymaker can find useful in answering whatever wider policy question they are posing. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I should say to our RSS members of the audience that I'm delighted. So the RSS is now working on a project to try and build those capabilities of being kind of good enough at analytics on policy civil servants.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful to the FTX Future Fund Regranting Programme for funding work on that. But great to hear that that's something that really is important.
Absolutely critical.
One sort of final question. So later today we're going to be talking about evaluation as our session today. There have been some real triumphs in Britain on evaluation in COVID, particularly the recovery trial,
Yeah.
the discovery of the usefulness of things like dexamethasone.
Yeah.
What are your views on how we used evaluation during the pandemic and what we could do? Could we have done more? Could we do more?
We can always do more, and we can learn from what we did well and what didn't go so well. This is why these sorts of lessons learned exercise are so important. But I think on evaluation, do you mean therapeutic and vaccine evaluation?
Therapeutics, but also other non-pharmaceutical interventions generally.
Oh,
using
God.
randomisation, for example, to...
Yeah, okay, right. So there's two answers to this question. The stuff that is measurable in a essentially clinical trial context, I think we absolutely nailed, right? And Andrew Pollard, JVT, these guys and all of their teams deserve knighthoods and damehoods, and a lot of them have already got them. They were amazing. I mean, the recovery trial, obviously, the best clinical trial in history. The vaccines trials, the MHRA's choice of how to use data in order to accelerate with the analysis without reducing the power of the results. These are total triumphs. They are within the context of essentially measurable results. Okay, so when you can put the result into the spreadsheet, we really did well. The bit that is almost impossible is to get the analytics of things that are hard to measure. I mean, during the autumn of 2020, we did run about as big a field trial of different lockdown measures as possible in the tiers system. We didn't rerun the tiers system after the second full lockdown for good reason, because it turned out not to be as effective as we'd hoped. Whether you can back out anything intelligent, given that movement wasn't banned and so therefore people went from one area to another, I don't know, and also because of the lags. The absolutely core data problem that we, in the crisis, which will bedevil all of this analysis, is the lag, right? The lag meant that by the time you knew an analytical answer to the question, are we doing enough, it was too late if you weren't. Right? That is the fundamental problem of pandemic management. And it led me to conclude you needed to go harder and earlier than you expected, which we did eventually in January 2021. That is not a problem that can be got round. That is a real world factual problem. Yes. Okay, and then there's a group of things in the middle. So between the hard end and the clinical trial ready analytics and the essentially social science end, which any economist like me is used to grappling with. There are a series of things in the middle, like for instance, really good work by Ben Goldacre on contributory factors to the risk of death if you catch COVID. That is tractable, even though it's harder to measure. So there's a full-blown spectrum.
That's very helpful. I think we're coming to the end of the allocated time. Were there any last reflections you had on that? Things that you think we should be taking away for the inquiry?
Well, there is quite. The questions I'd really like to answer are the things where you think that what I've said is rubbish.
Well,
do we have any questions from the floor?
Yeah.
The entire principles you've started the lockdowns with, the measures with, were based effectively on an unproven, at least at that time, a totally unproven argument that asymptomatic infection was a significant factor driving transmission. And there was no evidence for that whatsoever. The only evidence was based upon one Chinese woman in Germany who was taking large amounts of ibuprofen in order to prevent her from having symptoms. Now, I'm not saying that pre-symptomatic people who are just becoming ill couldn't transmit, at least in that first phase, but there was actually no evidence backing that up. Second point, there's a couple of points, if you don't mind, I'll put them all together so you can tie them up. The lockdown, you mentioned the lockdown measures and the forecasts. Neil Ferguson, because you said there wasn't 40 years of data, Neil Ferguson has been working on forecasting for decades, and the fact of the matter is, all his epidemiological forecasts have been wrong, every single one of them, and not by a factor of 1 or 2, but by a factor of 10 or 20 or 30 or 40, BSE, swine flu, bird flu, you name it, every single case, he was vastly incorrect. And the argument that there would have been 500,000 K dead had there not been a lockdown has no basis in fact. It's pure speculation. But because you can compare it with other countries around the world, and you can see, for example, in Sweden or even North Korea now, for God's sake, or Belarus or anywhere else, or Africa, there's no evidence whatsoever that the lockdowns made any difference, a beneficial difference to the number of deaths. And there's a citation for that. John Ioannidis, the leading epidemiologist in the world, along with many other experts, were banned from being on the YouTube and Facebook, and they were slandered and denigrated. And the government ministers should be protecting free speech. I was arrested 6 times for trying to defend free speech. So why don't you defend free speech and democracy in science?
Right. So the second point you make, sir, kind of demonstrates exactly what I was saying earlier, which is that making forecasts is hard, right? And making forecasts of what would happen if you did nothing, and then doing something, and the forecast not coming true does not disprove the forecast.
But now we know.
But hold on. I'm answering the question. Thank you. So in a way, what your question has demonstrated why it's really hard to communicate this stuff in the public domain. The second point on asymptomatic transmission is really important, and maybe I should have brought this up as a different example. There was not the formal evidence of asymptomatic transmission on a clinical trial basis, and therefore it didn't get into the formal advice to me. But we knew that there was a lot of stories of it happening.
What peer-reviewed documents proved it? What peer-reviewed documents? Well, we were locked at home for 2 years. Yeah, we got a right to ask the minister responsible.
I'll handle it, Stian. So you've had your say. This session is about how we measure these things better in future.
Well, you asked for criticism.
No, I'm afraid I'm not going to take anything further from you.
Okay.
Because you've had your say. Okay. You've asked your questions, 2 of them. I've just answered one, and I was halfway through answering the second when you started talking again.
The science,
no, that's enough. Thank you. You've had your questions. I'm now going to complete answering them, and then I'm going to go on to other people. Okay? Asymptomatic transmission is a classic example of that middle group of problems, right? It was really important that we found out whether there was asymptomatic transmission or not, and it didn't become a formal finding until the start of April. Yet we were worried about it happening before then, and so making decisions in the face of that uncertainty was one of the challenges with the evidence.
I'm sorry, what was the evidential paper that showed that? What was the paper that showed that? What paper showed that? He just said he was provided with that evidence in April. What paper showed it?
I'm really keen to. Tracy Brown presents about science, and we've corresponded.
It's a fair question, isn't it?
Before, which is you talked about uncertainty and dealing with uncertainty. And also about gathering the data you needed. Were these problems surely not hugely exacerbated by centralising away from departments? There was a massive underestimation of how important departments' knowledge of stakeholders and how to find out what was needed to know. And everything was sort of pushed through the number 10 message machine. And I know that analysts in other departments felt hugely frustrated that they weren't more engaged in the effort to sort of give that information through. This is how this policy needs to be implemented by 5,000 people across the care sector, 5,000 bus drivers who are having to decide, is a mask mandate worth leaving a teenager at an abandoned bus stop with no pavement? How do I
Yeah.
quantify those risks? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I
Whereas
do.
transport
So-
have that data.
So I think that's a really good challenge, and the challenge is the practical management of that problem was a consequence of having to bring things in so quickly. And when you bring in things as significant as we did, as quickly as we had to, you end up with you don't have the time to go through all of those details, and I think it's one of the reasons that we actually learned a lot in terms of how to implement these things for second time round, because there was time to put that sort of insight. But I think actually that's a really good finding in terms of, the centre needs to be coordinating. My view obviously I wasn't in the centre, I was in the department. My view in the Department of Health was to empower and push down decisions as much as possible to people who are as close to the ground as possible, rather than trying to centralise it up.
That, unfortunately, is all we've got time for, because we need to move on to the next stage. But Matt, thank you so much for joining us for that. This is incredibly valuable, I think, for everyone, for all of us to get the experience of what it was actually like to be there, to be the centre of decision making, and to commit in a very challenging environment. Very grateful to you for all you've done and for being with us here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Didn't have a paper that showed that at all.
To the next part of the
Yeah, let's go. So what was the document that showed that asymptomatic transmission was a thing? What April document showed that?
Thanks, Matt.
You made a statement that asymptomatic transmission was proven in April. What document was that? What document was it?
Thank you. You got
What
me.
document was it?
Excuse me.
What document was it? Are you trying to physically stop me from
I'm
moving?
not. I'm just trying to talk.
Are you detaining me?
I'm just trying to
Are
talk.
you detaining me from moving the door?
Can you not push me?
You're standing in
pushing
front
me.
of
I'm
me,
trying to
not
talk.
me,
Why are you
you.
pushing
You're
me?
standing in front of me, that's why. Get off me. What document? Matt, just one more question. One more question, Matt. Just one more question, Matt. In fact, I'm going to give you a present, yeah? Prove that. What was the document that proved asymptomatic transmission? What was the document that proved asymptomatic transmission? I tried to give him this
Do you
book.
believe that this natural law
What was
does
the
not apply to
document
you?
that showed that asymptomatic transmission is a significant
Does
factor?
that not apply to you?
Can't answer questions. You said you want questions and you can't answer them. I'm not going back in. What's the point in going back in? Rubbish.
What did you think he wouldn't answer? He said he saw a document in April, but he wouldn't actually provide where the document was. Or tell us the
Sorry about that. I
source.
tried to ask Matt Hancock what the evidence for asymptomatic transmission is, and he just wouldn't provide it. So that's really what we were trying to find out. You see, he was just basically, we can't really conclude anything, about what he said, because he was just basically lying. He didn't provide any evidence for that, for asymptomatic transmission. And in fact, they said that in April they were provided with evidence, but if they're provided with that evidence in April, where is it? And how did that inform future decisions? And therefore, if they didn't know about asymptomatic transmission until April, supposedly, then why did they lock the country down? Surely they should have just said, if you're ill, stay at home. So it just reveals, as soon as they're asked the question, their arguments collapse. And all you need is sycophantic goons backing them up, repeating what they say. That's all they rely upon. Sycophantic goons within the establishment. That's the truth.